Recently, Mr. Scullagrim in Canada tested a bronze Kopech. As the maker of that sword, I thought it was quite interesting because I've seen my swords tested before by archaeologists, but to be honest, it was done better in the YouTube film than anything I've ever seen on archaeologists do. And the reason was, Mr. Scullagrim understands swords and he knows how swords are used. So what I thought I'd do is give you a sword to test, which is my favourite sword, and it's probably one of the swords of the late Bronze Age in Britain. This sword, the Wilburton sword, and this sword are basically the same sword, but they're separated by several hundred years. This is later, so it's more developed. Between these two swords is probably about 2,000 of these swords in museums, in private hands, and there's probably in the summer a piece of one found every week by a metal detector somewhere. They are that prolific. A modern comparison would be something like the AK-47. It is a very popular sword. No other sword type in the British Isles can match this number. This is really huge numbers, partly because bronze lasts forever in the ground, or comparatively, but also it must have been immensely popular. All Bronze Age swords are quite light. The majority of them are under a kilo. So what they do very cleverly is they remove the blade just a little bit and create this soft midrib in there. So they keep the strength, but they lighten the blade by losing these sections here. We're looking at a piece of Ewart Park swords. This is quite a late sword. It's probably around 800, 700, 600 BC. It's hard to date swords. This line here, this is the edge of the sword where it's been forged down in antiquity to produce a hard, thin wafer of bronze which holds an edge quite nicely. They're trying to keep the weight down to about probably 500, 600 grams for a small sword like this at most. Probably 500 and maybe even lighter. The sword that's come into Canada, we've got the wide rib down the middle, it's got the edges forged, but I've also added some other tricks to it, because sword makers would have done this themselves. First thing I've done is I've actually artificially bent the blade and straightened it to work harden the bronze a bit to make the blade more rigid. It's a trade-off. The more you stiffen it up as a blade, the more chance it's going to be nearer its fatiguing points. The other thing I've done is I've work hardened into the blade. I've seen this on fragments of swords in museums where they've hammered the actual blade itself. On the finished sword you wouldn't see it, but because this is going to be tested until it sort of suffers, I thought I'd leave them in so you can actually see them. So these are hammer marks here, hammer marks and hammer marks. So you've got the forged edge, which makes it quite hard on the edge, but this will actually stiffen the blade and make it a more usable sword.
Alright, time to see how well this holds up. Got some paper here to test the initial sharpness, which is pretty good, as you can see. Alright, so the usual disclaimer for those who should know better but don't: this is obviously abusive testing. You're not supposed to do this with a sword. It's really just meant to test the material. That bites in pretty well. Okay, I think we have our first problem. It seems to be bent, a bit off center. Again, it's obviously not something that you're supposed to do. So it's slightly bent, not too much, and would be very easy to fix. Well, I should actually be able to...
Yeah, it is bronze, you should be able to... Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty much the easiest fix. You just bend it back over the leg.
Unlike steel, or, you know.
Which is also something that the Celts had to deal with. They had iron swords, but they were pretty mild, so they actually had to frequently bend them back in battle.
Yeah, the grip on that seems pretty small. Maybe like a leather wrapping or something would help drop a bit. Cold leather. Definitely knows the trick though.
It does. And it did straighten itself out, oddly enough. Whoa.
Nice.
That's pretty deep. That is impressively deep.
Yeah. One thing I'm noticing though is when you're striking, it tends to want to go twist when it's striking, and that's,
Yeah, it does.
I think that's what's causing most of your bending.
It is. Ooh.
There it is. Ooh, that's a nasty one too.
Yep. That's
About a 15-degree bend. 15 degrees.
that's quite a strong bend.
Definitely not a woodsman's axe.
No. But considering it's totally not meant for that.
Yeah, it's actually holding up pretty well.
But yeah, it just keeps bending, of course, which is not a surprise with this kind of abuse. That's just not what you would do at all. But yeah, it does bite in a lot. And also, it's really interesting to see, whenever you flip it around, it straightens itself out, actually. Yep,
that is doing good. That is making nice quick work with that log though, considering it's dead birch. And you know, dead birch being hardwood and dead birch being harder. Nice.
Okay, you can see the thickness. Dead birch, so pretty tough. All right, so right after that abusive test, let's see how well the edge holds up. It's not quite as sharp anymore, but it's still functional. There is really not much edge damage. That's all that happened to it. Got dulled a little bit, and it has a tiny, tiny nick right there. That's all that happened. So that's really not bad. At this point, the microphone didn't record properly, but I suppose all those thunk sounds are not all that essential anyway. Before anyone posts eco-terrorist comments, that tree is dead, so no reason to worry about that. I just wanted to see how well the tip holds up to hard abuse, and stabbing into a tree like this is very tough on the material, even in case of steel, so that's a good test to see how well it takes all the impact. And I was quite surprised, actually. The point didn't even bend and took very well to all of that abuse, despite even the prying, which again is very harsh on the material, but really no problem. Then I wanted to see how well it still cuts after all of that wood chopping abuse. And as you can see, it dealt with the soaked newspaper rolls really well, and those are quite tough to cut. They are very resilient. Right here it didn't go very far because the bottom of the newspaper roll actually had several wooden dowels in there, so that made it extremely resistant. As you can see here, it did cut the dowels after all, but it just couldn't get through all of them. Here again, no sound, unfortunately. I tested it on the shield I made, and I was definitely impressed with the result, because interestingly, the bronze sword actually got as far as my steel longsword. That is quite amazing. And this is what you would really use a sword for. If you are going to chop wood, it's going to be the wood of your opponent's shield. And cutting into a shield like that, if you're cutting into the rim, isn't all that hard, really. Thrusting into the shield didn't really do much. It damaged it only slightly, and it didn't accomplish much. From that, the point was very slightly bent, but not really all that noticeable, which is ironic because I also tried thrusting against the shield with the steel gladius, and it was actually bent out of shape more significantly afterwards, which is probably because it is a finer, thinner point. Okay, let's see how well it actually does against steel. Obviously the bronze will be a lot softer than this. This is not what you would normally do. You would generally parry with the shield and not use the sword for that, especially since it really has a minimal guard. So This is really a sword which is not for direct parrying, but for use with a shield. But just to see how well it holds up, let's try it. Stronger. 1, 2, 3. Oh!
Yep.
Well, obviously against steel it does not stand a chance at all. Even when trying to parry with the side, apparently just from the contact of the blade, just a little off to the edge, that already really chews it up. So against steel it's definitely way too soft, but that's of course no big news. Okay, let's see how well the damaged side still cuts. Probably it's not going to be too good. I have some dowels right here in the soaked newspaper roll. Looks like it cut all the way through the newspaper and into the dowel. There you go. It does still cut fairly well. Definitely easily through the newspaper and into the dowels. I just brushed lightly against the edge by accident, and this is what it did. I've got to say, I do feel bad for having tortured this poor thing like that, but I was asked to test it to the limits, and that's what I did. So what have we learned? Well, obviously bronze is significantly softer than steel, even comparatively mild steel. But it also makes a huge difference to have the edge hardened. Even though you have quite significant damage here, especially this spot right there where a bit of bronze was actually shaved off by the steel gladius blade. But on the other hand, it hasn't lost its sharpness all that much, even after all the hard use on the birch wood. It's still in fairly good shape. It is still sharp enough to be usable. It's really just where the steel edge tore into it. That's the main damage. Everything else is not too bad, really. The good news is that the softness means that it's not going to break. Even when the blade is flexed and warped quite a bit, it's you can always bend it back. Whereas if a hard blade were to shatter, obviously there's no way you can fix that. It's in this case, you can even something as simple as changing to the other edge while chopping, that may actually straighten it back out. What mainly happened when I chopped into the wood was it twisted inside the wood, and that put a lot of strain on the blade. And interestingly, whenever I switched around to the second edge, it had a tendency to straighten itself back out. But of course we have to keep in mind that trying to parry a modern steel sword with a bronze sword is not a fair test whatsoever. It's not the right comparison. Even medieval steel swords weren't as pure and hard as modern steel is, so even those wouldn't have fared as well against a modern sword. And obviously bronze is just can never be as hard as hardened steel, or probably even mild steel, untreated steel, simply because of the limitations of the material. However, if you were to go up against someone else with a bronze sword on a Bronze Age battlefield, I can see that working very well, because it is quite tough. I mean, as you saw, it's not going to break anytime soon. Maybe with many times of bending and straightening again, it might eventually weaken the material enough that it would break. But from just normal use, normal impact, especially considering that this was most likely used with a shield, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, really. It's still very tough, and you've seen how well it deals with the shield. It cut in surprisingly deeply, actually. The steel swords that I have don't do any better, so that's quite impressive. And I'm definitely impressed with how well the hardened edge holds up. Bronze may be pretty soft in and of itself, but the hammer hardening definitely makes a difference.
And finally, I'd like to express how much I appreciate the opportunity that Neil Burridge was kind enough to give me. It was great to be able to test this sword and put it through its paces. So a big thank you to you, Neil. I definitely appreciated that. And in general, if you have any interest in historically accurate Bronze Age replicas, that's the address. Neil is a fantastic craftsman. He's putting in so much work and effort into this, and you can really tell these are definitely swords that a Bronze Age warrior would be proud to wield, I'm sure. And now I'll have to go make sacrificial offerings to the gods of metal.